let's talk about Iowa and your state. According to the Brennan Center, which enacted laws at the 19 states which enacted laws that make it harder to vote. In Iowa, that includes significantly shortening the early voting period and closing voting sites an hour earlier. How do those changes make voting any more secure?
Well, it is the same level of security. What I would say is we still have 3 weeks of early voting before our elections day, which is far more liberal than the state of New York. So I would love to see the Brennan Center actually focus on New York. I think they only have 15 days of early voting. So it's still 3 weeks
why shorten
to
it?
go
why
in
shorten what
and
you already
vote.
had?
Because when you do that, you are manning election centers. And in rural communities like mine, where it really does make sense, simply local governments can't afford to step out there, continue to man as they would during a smaller election season. But Martha, I will push back. Our right to vote is important. And individuals need to know and understand what those time frames are. So shortening it by 7 days, 5 days, whatever it was, and allowing for that 3 weeks. It is still 3 weeks prior to an election, Martha. And so I would encourage all of those voters to get out. But again, my point is that we have Democrats that are targeting red states like Iowa, again, when our voter policies are far more liberal than blue states' voting systems. So the emphasis seems to be on red states, but not where there's actually the most restricting voting rules. So let's turn our attention to those states and make sure that those voters have the access necessary.
Hold on, you mean to tell me that Republican Senator Joni Ernst doesn't actually have a good answer as to how limiting the right to vote makes it any more secure? You don't say. Now, right off the bat, when Ernst is asked how those changes, like reducing the number of early voting days and closing voting sites earlier, makes voting more secure, she says, quote, well, it is the same level of security. Isn't the point of all these quote-unquote voter integrity laws being passed around the country to make voting more secure? And so if the security is exactly the same as before, Ernst's words, not mine, then the literal only difference is that access was restricted. Period. If nothing else changed except shortening the early voting period and closing voting sites an hour earlier, then by definition, the only difference here is that they made it more difficult to vote. And that really is the whole point. Republicans aren't actually looking to make voting more secure because guess what? Voting is already secure. Donald Trump's own Department of Homeland Security said that the 2020 election was the most secure in history. The only goal for these Republicans is to make it harder to vote because when people turn out, they lose. From there, Ernst pivots to whataboutism and points to New York because of course, because there quite literally is no answer as to how restricting voting and decreasing the number of days makes it more secure, in that it doesn't. And look, that's not to say that every other state, liberal or conservative, shouldn't also be offering more time to vote, because the whole point of a liberal democracy is that everyone should have their voices heard. And so if there's room for New York to expand its early voting days, then by all means they should. But that's still zero justification for why Iowa is shrinking its own voting days. If your only excuse as to why you're making it harder for people to cast ballots is to point to some random state 1,000 miles away, then you might just be telling on yourself. Consider too, there is only one party that has universally moved to restrict the right to vote. So I get that Joni Ernst would love nothing more than to pretend that New York and blue states are somehow the problem here when it comes to voting, but it's not the Democrats who introduced 440 voter suppression bills in 49 states. It's not the Democrats who are removing drop boxes from Democratic population centers. It's not the Democrats who are targeting Sunday voting when black churchgoers organize voter drives. It's not the Democrats who are allowing Republican-led state legislatures to reorganize local elections boards. It's not the Democrats who are passing laws making it difficult to apply for mail-in ballots. There is a party-wide shift within the GOP to make the entire process of voting from start to finish difficult. Not because it's not secure. In fact, voting is monumentally secure in the United States, and even Joni Ernst herself admitted on air that this is the exact same level of security, but because the goal is to prevent people, particularly people of color and young people who are more inclined to vote for Democrats, from voting. So she can point to every state under the sun, but her refusal to take responsibility for what's happening in her own state really does speak volumes. And look, this is all obvious. Everyone clearly knows why the GOP is playing these games and pretending that they're not doing what they are so blatantly doing. It's because they know that the only way that their party continues to exist into the future is if they rig the rules of the game. They know they can't win on their platform because no one wants to vote for a party that supports tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires, and that pretends climate change isn't real, and that strips women of their reproductive rights. And so instead of changing their platform, they're just changing the rules to ensure that if anyone is unhappy with the status quo and wants to get involved in the political process and vote, that it is as burdensome as humanly possible. It's a tale as old as Jim Crow. So Joni Ernst might want to train your attention elsewhere, but where there's smoke, there's fire. And it's Republicans like Ernst who are holding the matches. To see more videos like this, click the subscribe button right here on this screen. And if you want to support my work, subscribe to my podcast, No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen. I cover the most important stories each week, and my guest is always one of the top political figures, including Vice President Kamala Harris, Jen Psaki, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Nancy Pelosi, Katie Porter, Cory Booker, and so many more. The podcast link is also right here on this screen, so give it a listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.